Hello, everyone. I'm Kathleen McLean, Assistant Curator of Talks and Screenings at the AGO in Toronto. And thank you for joining us for today's talk with author Ross King and AGO Curator Alexa Greist to celebrate Ross's extremely new book, The Bookseller of Florence. Alexa and Ross, welcome. Thank you for
Thank you.
joining us. We begin by acknowledging that Toronto and the land the AGO is on is Nishisaka Anishinaabe territory, Mississauga. It's also governed by a treaty between the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Canadian government. The land has also been occupied by other Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat confederacies. So here's how tonight will go. Following my introductions, Ross will read a bit from his book. Alexa and Ross will then talk about it. And if time permits, we'd like to answer your questions, which you can ask using the Q&A feature near the bottom of your screen. Some thank yous. Thank you first to the TD Ready Commitment, our lead sponsor of talks and performances, for generously supporting this book. Thanks to Stephen Myers and the team at Penguin Random House Canada for bringing us together once again with Ross King. And thanks to Another Story Bookshop, which is a great independent bookstore in Toronto, where you can find The Bookseller of Florence available for sale. And later we'll post that link in the chat. So Ross King is an award-winning author known for taking crucial episodes in the history of both art and architecture and turning them into deeply enjoyable books, including Mad Enchantment, The Judgment of Paris, Brunelleschi's Dome, Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling, Defiant Spirits, The Modernist Revolution of the Group of Seven, and Leonardo and the Last Supper. Ross was born and raised in Canada and holds degrees from the University of Regina, Toronto's York University, and University College London. He now lives near Oxford, England. Joining Ross in conversation is Alexa Greist, who is Associate Curator and R. Fraser Elliott Chair, Prints and Drawings at the AGO, where she's curated exhibitions on mail art, that's M-A-I-L art, French prints of the 1890s, and rock posters. But before the AGO, Alexa held curatorial positions at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the Yale University Art Gallery. She holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, focused on, importantly for tonight's conversation, Italian printed drawing books, and her area of specialty is Italian Renaissance and Baroque prints and drawings. So welcome, Ross and Alexa. I am going to fade away, but I, of course, will remain here to help with images and other things, but take it away. And I think to begin, Ross, you were going to maybe start with an excerpt from the book.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Kathleen. And I reiterate your thanks to everyone. And it's wonderful to be back in Toronto at the AGO, if only virtually, this evening. Yes, I'm going to begin with a passage from the book. This is from quite early in the book, or actually later than I thought. I discovered it's page 100 of the book. And it's about how Vespasiano, who is the bookseller of Florence, so the title, goes about creating his manuscripts. And one of the first things he has to do is get the parchment on which it's going to be written. The only word that might be unfamiliar to you is cartolai or cartolaio, which simply means stationer bookseller, someone who sells paper. But of course, as we may discuss, a cartolaio did much more than sell paper. In any case, here we go. The word manuscript comes from the Latin manuscriptus, written by hand, but any manuscript was the product of much more work than simply the writing of a single hand. It was a months or even years-long multi-step process calling for the expertise of a series of tradesmen and specialist craftsmen, from parchment makers to scribes, miniaturists, gold beaters, and even apothecaries, carpenters, and blacksmiths. Vespasiano occasionally produced works on paper, of which, like all cartolai, he carried ready supplies. For the most part, though, his clients expected him to use parchment. Cartolai carried stalks of parchment, which was made from the skin of sheep or goats, and sometimes also from donkeys. The most beautiful and expensive material on which to write was calfskin or vellum, the word vellum coming, like the word veal, from vitulus, which was Latin for calf. The younger the calf, the finer and whiter the skin. Uterine vellum from aborted or stillborn calves was the finest and whitest of all, but also infrequently used. The supply of hides for parchment was always dependent on the dietary preferences of the local population. The appetite in Italy for goats, one recipe book offered advice on how to spit roast, boil, or stew them, how to cook their eyes, ears, lungs, and testicles, and how to make pies from their heads, meant that manuscripts in Italy were often made from goatskin. This reliance of the book industry on the palate of the locals is reflected in the lament by a 13th century patriarch of Cyprus, Gregory II, that not until after Lent, when people began eating meat again, would he be able to get the hides required for a manuscript of Demosthenes. For hundreds of years, the transmission of knowledge had depended on carnivorous appetites and good animal husbandry. Large volumes with hundreds of pages required the skins of many animals. One goat was often needed for each page of a parchment one goat was often needed for each page of parchment in a large liturgical book, such as an antiphonary, while a Bible might take the skins of more than 200 animals, an entire herd of goats or flock of sheep. So if you're a vegan, look away now when you see an ancient Bible, a Bible from the Middle Ages, because the sort of number of animals that it took to make them is actually quite astounding.
Thank you, Ross, for diving right into, well, the meat, for a pun, of your book. And as someone who is a material specialist and works on paper and loves to, be with the objects, I really appreciated the detail and the level in your book for all of the different materials that are involved in the creation of these illuminated manuscripts. I just wanted to start tonight by stating that you've spent a lot of time thinking about Florence, thinking about Italy, with Brunelleschi's dome, being in Florence, and then looking at Michelangelo and the Pope's ceiling, but his training in Florence. And you've thought about this, researched it, written a lot about the time period that's often referred to as the Renaissance. When did you first become aware of Vespasiano and the important role that he ended up playing, I would almost say shockingly outsized role he ended up playing in the transmission of knowledge during this time period?
Well, in many ways, I had no idea just how big how big his role was, until I started doing the research for it a couple of years ago, or well, actually going back about four and a half years now. The name pops up if you read about the period. If you read maybe a general history of Florence in the 1400s, or if you read a biography of Cosimo de' Medici, or a book on illuminated manuscripts from the 15th century, he will pop up. But very briefly, and usually with the epithet, an interesting epithet that caught my attention, Cosimo de' Medici's favorite bookseller. And I started to wonder what exactly that meant and who he was. And I knew that he wrote a book on, which is on the lives of illustrious men and also one woman in the 1400s. And so I got a copy of it and began reading it. And this is the book from which information is harvested about Cosimo de' Medici. He's the one, for example, because Vespasiano knew Cosimo extremely well, he's the one who gives us this insider's account of what Cosimo was like in his moments of leisure, the fact that he liked to play chess, that he would rise early to go and prune the vines of his vineyard at Careggi, and things like that. But as I read the book, I realized that there was enough of Vespasiano in it in order for me to reconstruct, in some ways reconstruct his life, but more to the point, to use him as a kind of point of departure for Florence in what Vespasiano himself calls the golden age of Florence. Because Vespasiano, to give his life dates, to introduce him, He was born 1422. As far as is known, that's a little bit of a guess because his birth record has never been found, but from his tax documents that he files later where he gives his age, you can count back and figure out he's probably born in late 1422. So he was born in 1422 and died in 1498, which is the year that Girolamo Savonarola is executed. He died about 2 months after that. So his life spans the glory years of Florence in the 1400s. And it just seemed to me that the way he was so well connected, because his lives of 113 famous men and one woman in the 1400s is written because of the fact that he knew all of them. And these are people like various popes, Nicholas V, who was a very good friend of his, Cosimo de' Medici and his two sons, Piero and Giovanni. And so I realized that I could use him and his activity as a bookseller to tell a number of stories about Florence. I could talk about the intellectual culture of Florence and try to show that Florence wasn't simply about artists, architects, painters, architects, and sculptors in the 1400s, people like Brunelleschi, Masaccio, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, people I've written about previously, but also it was about humbler characters in some ways, scribes and scholars and students and superannuated priests who worked in the book trade. And so I realized that Vespasiano could open up that world to me and I could begin telling their story against the backdrop, against the kind of macrocosm of Italy in the course of the 1400s because of his connections to people like the kings of Naples. He was very good friends with and dealt his manuscripts to 3 generations of the kings of Naples, just to give one example of his connections. And so it just seemed that he was a kind of focal point for so much of what went on in a period that I find absolutely fascinating. And I was surprised I hadn't written more about him or managed to smuggle him into any of my previous books because of just the level of importance that he had and the level of interest that I discovered I ultimately had in him.
Thank you. Hearing you say that, he's connected to both these, the figures who have been written about in histories, whose lives have been recorded by, by the chroniclers and by, for centuries. I also really like what you say about, Vespasiano himself. He's not a nobleman. He's not, born to great wealth. He is in many ways a craftsman, as you described the role. He starts as working in, creating book covers and bindings. And I really appreciate what you say there about their scribes. And they're all these people who come together to make these luxury objects that are consumed by a very elite class. And I really especially appreciate, and I love that you also point out 113 plus one woman, which a lot of artist biographies, those who've read any of them know there's often only one woman or a token sort of woman. But I really appreciated as an art historian, as a woman, as someone who wants to look at the people who, maybe made works of art that were not considered the high point painting, sculpture, drawing, that you highlighted women's involvement in one particular part of your book, that you highlighted the involvement of nuns in a cloister as compositors, the ones who put together movable type. And I just, women in the period, as you well know, are so involved in workshops, often taking over workshops. If they're the widow or the daughter of an artist or a paper maker, or they're really involved in these behind the scenes ways. And I really appreciated the way you brought that to the fore, not just for women, it's also for people who aren't in the highest, let's say, elite echelons of society that have been written about.
Right, right. And that was one of the great pleasures of writing it, is that's sort of the second strand of the book, because on the one hand, we have Vespasiano and manuscript culture, where he is described as the king of the world's booksellers. Again and again, people reiterate that he is the go-to guy for a manuscript because he's the one who can find you the exemplar, the best copy from which to take a copy of Cicero's orations or whatever book it is that you want produced. He can get the best copy because of his scholarly acumen, and get the best scribes and illuminators to work on it, produce something very beautiful. And so he has this great eminence, but of course, what happens in the course of his career, he begins work as an 11-year-old boy. And one of the things we might want to consider about Renaissance Florence is they had what we would classify as child labor. He left school at the age of 11. As you point out, he came from fairly humble circumstances. His father died when he was 4, and his mother fell into debt, and he had to go to work and earn a living along with his brothers and sisters at the age of 11. And yet he rose up and to become such an eminent person. He became an intimate of the Pope. And so there's a kind of democratization of well, there's social mobility, but also a kind of democratization of knowledge happening at this time. Because one of the things that I was interested in exploring or trying to figure out is how a boy who had maybe 5 years of schooling, 5, 6 years schooling maximum, left school at 11 and ended up in a bookshop, which wasn't necessarily the career path you might have expected from someone in his circumstances. You would expect him to go into a much more populous occupation, one in which his father was involved, the wool trade. And yet somehow someone spotted that this boy is very bright, or this boy has expressed a wish to work with books. And that's what happened. And so just through his own, I think, personal charm, as well as his intelligence, he worked his way up. So that's one half of the story. And he works his way up to become this incredibly eminent dealer, probably the biggest dealer in manuscripts before Sotheby's and Christie's and companies like that. But the other half of the story, of course, is the printing press gets invented really when he's in mid-career. Gutenberg's Bible comes out, his 42-line Bible comes out in 1454, which is 20 years after Vespasiano began work in the street of booksellers in Florence. And so this is obviously going to have an impact on his career. And the way I looked at the impact is exactly what you were referring to, Alexa. His opponents become a printing press that fires up in 1476 in Florence in a Dominican convent where there are nuns, a group of nuns, not all that many of them, only about 50 of them. And they begin producing under the supervision of their procurator, a man named Fra Domenico. They begin producing manuscripts, or sorry, printed books, both ephemera, sort of little souvenirs that would be sold on feast days to pilgrims passing through Florence, but also ultimately in one of the greatest publications of the 15th century. One of the great incunables of the 15th century is their complete edition of the Latin translation of Plato by Marsilio Ficino. So this group of nuns produced the mighty Plato in Latin for the first time in print and made it accessible in 1,000 copies all across Europe in the way that Plato had never been accessible previously. And for me, that story is fascinating enough that happens without it being the nuns, without it being the women. And it just becomes that much more fascinating when they're involved. And it gave me opportunity to talk about something that I'd not been able to talk about too much in some of my previous books, which is the place of women in Florentine society and in Florentine workshops. Because you're absolutely right, Alexa, women were much more involved in painting, in manuscript illumination. Women worked as scribes. There were 5 convents in Florence in which the nuns worked as scribes and did decorations on liturgical books that they copied out, as well as doing, as I described, the convent, San Jacopo de Ripoli, this Dominican convent where the printing press opens, was a hive of industry. And besides printing books, the nuns were also involved in creating silver brocade and things like that. There were these little cottage industries within within the walls of the convent. And so they really acted as economic agents, both for the good of the city itself to sort of bolster the economic resources of the city. Also, of course, to bolster the chances of their soul, because in the afterlife, because of the fact that idle hands are the devil's work. But also it was a kind of revenue stream for themselves. And they were paid, the nuns who were compositors, who were effectively typesetters for things like the complete works of Plato or the Legend of St. Catherine, or many of the things that they published. They were paid individually, and this went into their own coffers. And so they were able to maybe purchase something a little bit better for themselves because of it. So that was one of the great pleasures of working on the book, is immersing myself in that culture of these people who I think history, for the most part, forgot for a long time. They're being rediscovered right now, thankfully. But for many centuries, history was written by the men who set up the canon of who was going to be allowed into the club of great Renaissance figures. And very few women were allowed into that. But I think we're now discovering, as people go into the archives and as paintings and manuscripts are being rediscovered, we're realizing that women were actually far more active than they were given credit for many centuries afterwards.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And, you know, I was just thinking, as you mentioned, Gutenberg, obviously, yes, you say there's two big sides to this story. And I know you have some images, and I think my next question might lend to us showing or looking at a few of the images of, as you bring up Gutenberg and the movable type. Thank you. My next question is, you know, the idea, the sort of commonly held truth that, or idea, not truth maybe, that the printing press revolutionizes when it's you know, comes about in the West. It existed in the East earlier, the idea of movable type, but when it comes to the West, that it almost overnight changes everything, that it revolutionizes the way knowledge spreads and the way people consume knowledge. And when I was studying, it was brought up and started reading things saying, no, well, it's not quite true, actually. And so I was wondering how you felt when you started reading these things, which you may have read years before you wrote this book, but about the fact that, and you highlight it in your book, the illustrated, illuminated, hand-created luxury object of the manuscript survives heartily alongside printed movable type books for quite a long time.
Yeah, that was one of the, I mean, I must confess that was a revelation to me. And one of the most interesting things I discovered as I was writing the book, because of the fact that most histories, they're very good histories of print, but generally if you're writing about print very briefly and want to give a kind of as succinct as possible analysis of what happens, the history will go from Gutenberg in the 1450s and his 42-line Bible, maybe the Bamberg Bible and some of these things. And then it fast forwards through decades, and we get to Martin Luther, who was incredibly prolific with the printing press. And so we automatically, we jump some 80 years forward in history. But what I found fascinating was what's known as the incunable period, incunable being a reference to cradle, the sort of swaddling clothes of the book industry. Yes, here's Vespasiano looking very somber. But what happens is actually much more interesting, because there's this crossover or hybridization between and among books, printed books, and manuscripts, because the British Library has a copy of Gutenberg's 42-line Bible, which is hand decorated. And one of the stories is that when Gutenberg turned up at the Frankfurt Fair in October of 1454 with his Bibles, he claimed that he didn't say that these were printed with artificial letters or anything, and he had a new invention. What he claimed instead, according to rumor, according to legend, is that these were copied out by a scribe. And to the untrained eye, and every eye on earth was untrained for printed books at this point, you could have easily believed that because of the fact that the British Library's copy is on parchment and has hand decorations to it and rubrication and all of these things. Because of course the printed book had to look as much as possible like a manuscript if it was going to sell. There was a step change in technology, but the aesthetics of it couldn't change. The aesthetics had to be much the same as they'd been for centuries or at least decades before, because ultimately the printed book takes on the form of the style of books created by um, uh, Vespasiano, uh, by his scribes, because he didn't invent it, but he adopted a style of handwriting that developed in Florence in the early 1400s. It first developed right around the year 1400. You could almost call it the year 1400 style of handwriting. Kathleen, can we go to that? I'm not sure what number it will be. Yes, so these are shots of where his bookshop was. Yes, one or two more. This is it. Yes, this is, I mean, look at this beautiful handwriting. If you can't, if you know Latin and you just learn one or two tricks, such as the fact that the S's look like F's, the double S's especially look like F's, you can make out every letter. I mean, everyone can look at this screen and guess at how to spell these words. And this is something that was done in Florence. This style of writing developed in Florence in the early 1400s, and all of Vespasiano's scribes were trained in this particular style, what we now call humanistic handwriting, because for the most part it was used in the books that the humanists were interested in, i.e. those from classical history, the works of Cicero, for example, the works of Seneca. All of these works were copied out in this particular style of handwriting. And so when the printing press came to Italy in the 1460s, even though the printers were Germans who had used in Germany what we think of as the Gothic type, they quickly realized that what they needed to do was cater to Italian tastes and make their print look like Italian handwriting, look like this humanistic script. And that's why, I mean, these printers in Rome and also these scribes in Florence are the ones that saved us 500 years of eye strain and headaches and blindness by moving away from the very fussy, difficult to read Gothic script with all of its serrations. This is what the Florentines scholars hated about it. They could not read Gothic script. They wanted something more simple, something that would be copied more quickly. And this is now called, if we translate this into print, it's called Roman, but it equally could be called Florentine because of the fact that it's a style that actually developed there. And so what happens, I mean, what Alexa was referring to is the fact that there is an overlap for decades between the manuscripts of people like Vespasiano and printed books. And just to give you an example, one of the most interesting statistics in the book, I think, is that the year in which more manuscripts were copied than any other year on Earth, any other year in history, was 1470. In other words, 15 years after Gutenberg perfected the printing press, manuscripts were still being produced in greater numbers than ever before. And in fact, from the 1460s to the 1470s, manuscript production increased 40%. And so there's this huge number of manuscripts being produced even as the printing press is rattling and clanking north of the Alps, and then by the 1460s and 70s, south of the Alps in Italy and also in Spain and places like that. And you find books which are half manuscript and half printed book. I think, and we of all generations, I think, can appreciate this sort of horses for courses style that people had. Collectors owned both, a lot of collectors owned both handwritten manuscripts and printed books in the way that we today own, I'm sure all of us own paperbacks, hardbacks, ebooks, and audiobooks. And, we go for certain books in a certain format. And that's exactly what they were doing at that time as well. And just a last point on that, the great period, or one of the greatest periods in history of manuscript illustration is the second half of the 1400s. It's known as the golden age of manuscript illustration because you had people like Margaret of York ordering vast quantities of illustrated manuscripts. And Vespasiano catered to these people. He catered to Federico da Montefeltro, creating perhaps 900 or 1,000 manuscripts for his library in Urbino. And people like Federico da Montefeltro did not want to have a printed book. Lorenzo de' Medici would buy a printed book and then have it turned back into a manuscript. So he would reverse engineer it. And so all of this is going on in the decades, in the really 50 plus years after Gutenberg has created the printing press. So the story is, I think, much more interesting. And the way in which these two art forms and these two crafts bounce off each other and respond to each other over the decades, taking things. The title page was invented by Vespasiano. I mean, we can thank him for that. He took it out of, he saw a manuscript from the 1200s, an old Tuscan manuscript in the 1200s that had something that looked like a title page. And he thought, this looks like a good idea. And he added it to his manuscripts. And then, of course, printers, seeing his manuscripts, began adopting his idea of the title page.
I mean, that's such a wonderful, even just sort of piece of knowledge of the creation of books that I had no idea before. And I really appreciate that. Thinking about just something you said made me think about all the work to the idea of that how much work went into finding, not just creating these books, but to finding the pieces of, and here we're talking about Roman, Greek manuscripts that were written, 2nd century BC up through, 500 years post Common Era, and thinking about how they're sought out, they're pulled together, they're compared to each other because, you lose half of one book written by an author by Livy or Pliny the Elder, and you lose these pieces, and then they're all brought together, and Vespasiano, knowing how to pull these all together to create the best possible or most authoritative copy for his for the person who's seeking it. I mean, that network of people that he had to have at his disposal is incredible, and you tell that story throughout the book so well.
I think he probably had what we would call today photographic memory. He somehow knew, not instinctively, but through experience, which then stayed with him, of where books were, where manuscripts were. He could tap into a lot of libraries in Florence, private libraries and also public libraries. He had access to Cosimo de' Medici and Cosimo's sons' libraries. He had access to the library of the Badia, the Benedictine Abbey, literally across the street from his shop in the Street of Booksellers. And so he had knowledge, but he also obviously had personal charm because there had to be a kind of emollients to getting access to these things. He would have to go to someone and ask them, could I have your, the first 10 decades of Livy, this massive, incredibly valuable manuscript. Livy was probably the most expensive of all books. A Livy was worth probably 120, 130 florins. And to put that in context, you could buy a house in Florence, a very good house on the Arno, for roughly that price. So it was incredibly expensive. And he would borrow it. And so there was a certain amount of trust, and then get it reproduced in multiple copies. And so he was very important for the dissemination of knowledge that way, because what he was doing, he was part of a great humanist project, which began a generation or two before him with writers in the 1300s who looked around them and saw a kind of wreckage of their civilization. If we think of what happened in the 1300s, Barbara Tuchman, many of you might know her book, A Distant Mirror, which has the title, The Turbulent 14th Century. And there are a lot of adjectives you could use besides turbulent because a lot of terrible things happened there. The Black Death, of course, of 1347 to 49, but also the 100 Years' War began at that time. The papacy fled Rome, left Rome and went to Avignon. When it came back to Rome, briefly, someone else popped up in Avignon claiming to be Pope. And so there was this papal schism. The church was split. And there was also famine and poverty. And so I think people sort of climbed out of the wreckage of the 1300s, and tried to think, how can we make a better world? What can we do that is going to improve our lives personally, that's going to make us more happy, which they, as much as us, were concerned about, but also the larger question, how can we have a better society? How can we educate our children better? How can we rule our cities in a better way? If we're going to go into battle, how can we be more successful at that? And so they looked back to the ancient Romans. They believed, I think maybe unsurprisingly, that the greatest civilization on earth had been the Roman Republic / Roman Empire. And so they looked back to that. And their question was, how can we replicate that in the present? What is the playbook? What's the guidebook or the template that we can use? And the template, of course, is going to be found in the writings of people like Livy and his history of Rome from its beginning until his lifetime during the reign of Augustus. Cicero, the most coveted book from the ancient world that was lost and sadly would not be found until after Vespasiano's time, was Cicero on a republic. And Florence was a republic, they were desperate to find out what Cicero said about republican governments, the best way to rule them. And so they believed that there was wisdom in these books, and that if they could only get these books and read them and understand them and then disseminate them, they could create a better world. And in many ways, they believed that they did, or at least they had begun doing that by creating what Vespasiano himself says was the golden age of Florence. I mean, the interesting thing about the Florentines by the middle of the 1400s is that they look upon themselves as living in a golden age. Usually a golden age is either in the future, we're going to try to make it somehow, or it's far in the past. It's something that's been lost, and we now live in an age of iron or lead. But the Florentines believed by the 1440s and 1450s that they were a special chosen people and had accomplished something remarkable, and were really recapturing the glories, the grandeur that was ancient Rome. And Vespasiano was very much at the forefront of that project, that idea to rediscover wisdom and virtue, and put it into operation in Florence, in Italy more generally, in the course of the 1400s.
You used the word dissemination and knowledge there, and it brings up a quote that really stood out to me from a figure at the time, from Angelo Poliziano. And it was on page 272. I wrote it down, and it said, he's saying here, talking about the printed book, the movable type, and the fact that there you can create hundreds of, I want to say impressions because I'm a print person, but you can create hundreds of copies of this. And he says, now the most stupid ideas can, in a moment, be transferred into 1,000 volumes and spread abroad. And so that also brings up a couple of things for me. One, the idea that, oh, the movable type, it exists, everyone's happy, everyone's thrilled. And also, but it was sort of the contrast to that idea, as you're saying, of the humanists, this group of select people getting together, finding the best copies, collating, looking at them, all of that. And here he's sort of talking about, maybe a divergent way of thinking about knowledge, that if it's not controlled, it can be it can be spread a different way and be very dangerous. That it, to me, felt also like a very modern statement, of course.
Yes. I think we can think of all sorts of modern parallels with this, and that maybe, as we would expect, the printing press had its advocates, people like Pope Paul II in the 1460s, who really embraced it and celebrated it, and would go to printing shops and watches papal bulls being printed and things like that. And some of the people at the papal court at that time celebrated it as a divine gift from heaven, because now the word of the Lord could be propagated even more prolifically than before. However, and other people believed that wasn't simply the word of the Lord, it was that knowledge could be safeguarded. One of the courtiers under Paul II wrote about how Livy's History of Rome is the biggest book written in the ancient world, and 3/5 of maybe 4/5 of it has been lost forever. And this was much more. And this great history of Rome, so many of the books of it had been lost. And one of the scholars at the court said, if Livy had had the printing press, his book would have survived, because many copies of it would have been made, and it would have come down the centuries. So there were people who celebrated it for that reason. It would safeguard knowledge against things such as fires and wars and invasions and all of the things that endangered books, and also just the vicissitudes of time. On the other hand, there were those people who, as Alexis said, believed that this was dangerous. It was dangerous for two reasons. Number one, it was spreading ignorance, because of the fact that while Vespasiano took the exemplar, he would find the best copy of a manuscript and correct it. He would have scholars look at it, he would look at it himself, and only then and only then would he reproduce it. But what he feared, and what in fact did happen, is that careless printers who weren't actually scholars in their own right would simply get a manuscript which might be riddled with errors. All manuscripts had errors, but it would be riddled with errors that they would make no attempt to correct. And instead of just making one copy, as they would have done previously, which wouldn't have caused that much damage, they would make 275, which was the usual print run in those days, or sometimes, if it was an important book, they would make 1,000 copies. And this then created great problems. So that was what the scholars worried about. What others worried about, in some ways moralists, is this was going to corrupt public morality, because of the fact that some of the Italians said these are drunken Germans who are printing licentious stories that are going to corrupt young people. But also what they're doing, they claimed, was printing things that people had no right to know. Knowledge was now going to be passing down from the elite, from the more educated people, to less educated people and underclass, who did not know how to deal with that knowledge, and who are going to maybe be whipped up into a kind of political frenzy or a rebellious frenzy because of it. And one of the things, of course, they worried about was the Bible. Was the Bible going to be printed in the vernacular, in the vulgar tongue in various countries, so that people could read it? This is something that was a great fear among churchmen, among the popes. Pope Leo X, for example, had been a Medici pope, was very worried about this. And so there were the good and the bad. And I think, once again, we of all generations, we of all people living today can relate to these anxieties with the idea of the internet and fake news, and the fact that you can put out a tweet saying something erroneously, saying something slanderous, and it can be retweeted hundreds, thousands, millions of times perhaps, and without any kind of quality control, until finally it's taken down or it's refuted. And so what interested me was that the objections to the printing press are extremely similar to the objections to and reservations about the internet that we've had for the last 30 years.
I really felt that, I just really felt that about that quote. And I think I have one more question I want to ask you. Actually, Kathleen, can you go back to the image that we just had of Federico da Montefeltro? I have one last question, then I want to be able to open it up for others. So this image and this figure of Federico da Montefeltro, sorry, there's text probably pinging on my computer, apologies. But there's this striking dichotomy that really emerges, and you tease out and talk about in your book, between learning and violence at this time, and certain figures. You also spoke of Naples, and the scholar, someone here who puts the finest library, 900 to 1,000 illustrated manuscripts just from Vespasiano, saying, you know, and then he's also an incredible warrior, incredibly successful for hire warrior. So I wonder, do you see this as sort of unique to the place or something that kept coming up over and over through Vespasiano as the link, the people he's working for?
Yeah, see, this is the great irony of that humanist project that I talked about. They said we want to make ourselves better people. We want to have a better society. We want to be more successful. We want to be better educated. But many of the people saying that, many of the scholars saying it, the sort of, excuse me, the humble scribes, what they said they wanted to create, their ambition was to create what Quintilian, the greatest rhetorician of imperial Rome, called the good man speaking well, someone who was both articulate, who could speak very eloquently, but was also virtuous and used his eloquence to promote virtue. This was their goal, and they all paid lip service to it. But as I describe in the book, some of the most dreadful, vile, embarrassingly hostile people that you could ever imagine were these humanists. People like Francesco Filelfo, who was an absolute terror. I mean, they got into knife fights and testicle squeezing matches in the Roman Curia. I mean, they had these dreadful fights among themselves. Then at a higher level, at the higher of Federigo, and thank you for bringing him up, because he exemplifies this strikingly Renaissance type of someone who combines a number of things. Extreme cultural refinement. There is no doubt Federigo was a great scholar. He was also the greatest soldier of the age. He became fabulously wealthy because he was the most expensive guy to hire. He virtually never lost a battle. He was known as the stormer of citadels. He could take any city for you, but he would then often massacre the inhabitants. So we have this refinement combined with murderous savagery. And again, we see this in Vespasiano's clients. I talked about the kings of Naples. King Ferrante was a very good friend of his, and yet was, I mean, some of you may know about him. Ferrante was king of Naples in the middle part of the 1400s, and he dealt with his political enemies in Naples, the barons who rebelled against him, by executing them, embalming their bodies, and then posing them in a museum of mummies. And so he had these terrible, gruesome whimsies at the same time that he had this fondness for classical literature, for which he turned to Vespasiano. And to Vespasiano's credit, perhaps, he ultimately became disillusioned with what had happened. I think he saw the humanism as the light that failed, because by the end of the 1400s, the golden age had passed. And Vespasiano, I think, really became quite depressed about the situation. And that depression and disillusionment begins in some ways in 1478 with the Pazzi conspiracy against the Medici, which Federigo de Montefeltro was involved in. And in some ways, Vespasiano was involved in, because many of the murders, I'm sure many of you know about it, it's where Sixtus IV, the Pope, and Federigo de Montefeltro tried to kill the two Medici brothers, Lorenzo and Giuliano. They killed Giuliano. Lorenzo escaped, but they tried to unseat the Medici in Florence and put the Pazzi, their commercial rivals, in their place. And once the Pazzi failed, there was it was the darkest moment in 15th century Florentine history of, I mean, Machiavelli was a 9-year-old boy at the time, and he describes seeing limbs of bodies in the streets and in the countryside. And heads were, the Bargello, the building next to Vespasiano's shop, had the head of a mercenary captain stuck on the door. There were naked bodies stuck in a notary shop across the street, people who've been executed. There's this horrendous bloody reprisal. And Vespasiano really despaired about this. This was not the sort of Florence that he had been dreaming about, the sort of world that he had been working towards. And in some ways, that, as much as the printing press, I think, made him abandon this project in 1480, because not to ruin the ending of the book for you, but ultimately he closes up in 1480, he closes up his shop, and the contract for closing his shop, interestingly enough, just as an aside, was written by, drawn up for him by Sir Piero da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci's father, who was an eminent notary and whose shop was 2 doors down from Vespasiano's bookshop. And so I think he, in many ways, turned his back in the last decade or two of his life on this. And when he wrote his lives of illustrious men, he was conjuring nostalgically a world that had once existed and which he now saw passing into history. And all I can say is he's lucky he didn't live into the next century, because things got even worse, as what one historian of the time, a friend of Machiavelli, called the troubles of Italy, began at that point. And Vespasiano, well, was safely dead and buried at that time, because I think we would have been absolutely destroyed by what happened to Italy over the course of the next couple of decades after his death.
Thank you for that. I have a few questions that have popped up that have been brought to me from people who are tuning in. And I think I'll just go in order. We have a question here saying whether we might equate the experience of Vespasiano and his shop versus other booksellers to something almost like traditional publishers versus self-publishers.
Yes, very much so. But I think even more than Vespasiano, because what he was doing as a publisher, because he was a bookbinder, that was probably the first trade he learned. He was a bookbinder. He was a sort of overseer, an editor, and also a publisher. But he did, for the most part, bespoke work. You would commission something from him. You would come into his shop. I describe a number of cases where very eminent people, the man who's on the cover of the book, or the man whose hand is on the cover of the book, Cardinal Bessarion, in a very famous moment, comes into his shop and asks him to find him, to produce for him a copy of Ptolemy, Ptolemy's geography. And so he was bespoke rather than putting things out on spec. I think publishers today would very much identify with the printing press of San Jacopo di Ripoli, which is the one that the nuns were the compositors for. Because as I described, the account books for San Jacopo still exist. And in them, in his squiggly writing, Fra Domenico describes going through the streets of Florence with armfuls of books. He printed his Legend of St. Catherine. He goes around Florence trying to sell it. And he says, I took some to the prior in Santa Lucia, and she kept it for a week. And then continually he's writing, we got this back, this was returned, etc. And so I think as an author or for a bookseller, this sounds all too familiar, that you've put your heart and soul into something and it gets returned by the person who it was given to.
Thank you. Sort of along that line, we have a question. What subject matter was the most popular in the 15th century? I assume the question is about in illuminated manuscripts, but I mean, you know so much also about what started taking over in printed, so maybe both of those.
What was most popular in the 15th century was also what was most popular in the 14th century. And my answer to this question is very timely because it's the 700th anniversary of his death this year, coming up in September, and that is Dante, the Divine Comedy. And so it wasn't actually a work in Latin, it was a work in the vernacular, in the Florentine tongue. Dante, by far, was the best-selling author, or most copied author of the 1300s. There are still many copies of these that were done by non-professional scribes, people who simply made copies of it as gifts for friends or gifts for parents, gifts for children, and so forth. They're known as the copyists for passion because they were doing it out of their love for the Divine Comedy. He still really is at #1 through the 15th century in Florence. But if we go spread the net a little wider than Florence, the biggest selling author or translator, author and translator in the 15th century was Leonardo Bruni, who maybe isn't a name to conjure with. He's someone who was incredibly important to the story that I tell in this book, but to Florentine culture more generally. When you go into Santa Croce, the Franciscan Basilica in Florence, and which is the kind of pantheon of the Florentine greats, they've got Dante's empty tomb waiting for him in case Ravenna ever decides they're going to release his body, which won't ever happen. They've got Machiavelli, Galileo, Michelangelo, Gioacchino Rossini, all of these great Florentines or Tuscans are buried there. And in pride of place, reclining on his tomb in effigy is Leonardo Bruni. And he was the great translator of Aristotle and Plato, and was, he died in 1444 before the printing press, but more manuscripts of Bruni's works survive, and I'm sure were written, than any other author in Italy over the course of the 15th century. He wrote a lot of books on the history of Florence. He was incredibly prolific, and ultimately he became Chancellor of Florence, the highest office in the land, the most senior civic post. And so he was a vital person. And of course, once the printing press came out, his works, of course, went into print. Someone I talk about towards really in the second half of the book, was also a bestseller. He was really the first great scholar to embrace the printing press, and he became a bestseller. And that was Marsilio Ficino, who also translated Plato, but also wrote his own philosophical and theological treatises. And again, Ficino is an absolutely crucial person in the history of Florentine and indeed European thought over the course of the 15th century.
Thank you. I think we have two more questions. We'll try to fit them in. One that is asked is, how did Vespasiano's achievements and collection of biographies influence Vasari a century later?
Good question. I see that comes from my friend Louis Gagliardi. Hello,
Yes.
Louis. To be honest, not a lot, because Vasari, of course, is interested in artists, and Vespasiano wasn't. He writes surprisingly little. In his Lives of Illustrious Men, there is no Filippo Brunelleschi. There is no Leonardo da Vinci, who he probably met, and he almost certainly met Brunelleschi because they had friends in common. He doesn't write about artists. He is concerned about writers, scribes, political leaders, people like that. And so I think Vasari was influenced by the tenor of it. Vasari certainly knew it. Excuse me, he was interested in the idea of celebrating great people for posterity, but they didn't write about the same people at all. Who was influenced by Vespasiano, and what Vespasiano's greatest legacy was, you could argue, was his this book of lives that he wrote towards the end of his life, because he produced, it's impossible to say how many manuscripts he produced. It might have been 3,000, it might even have been more, but at least half or maybe even 2/3 of those have been destroyed. There were terrible fires in Pesaro. He did a magnificent library in Pesaro for Alessandro Sforza and his son Costanzo, and that burned in the 1500s, as did the library of Matthias Corvinus in Hungary, who he also did work for. He did work for someone who, King Matthias, stole all his books. And that was burned in the 1500s. So many of these have been lost. So in some ways, you can't say that his legacy is the dissemination of this knowledge, because of course the printing press would disseminate it ultimately much, much more widely than he could. Rather, his legacy is that book of Illustrious Men, and it reaches prominence. He of course did not print it. He wrote it up, had it written out by hand. Only a few copies existed. Fortunately, in the 1830s, one of them was discovered in the Vatican Library by the Vatican librarian, a cardinal named Angelo Mai. And what Angelo decided to do would be to print it. And so it was printed for the first time in the middle of the 19th century. And who should discover it about 10 years later but a Swiss historian named Jakob Burckhardt, who had come to Rome to do some research on art, discovered this, read it, was electrified by it, and it exposed him for the first time to the intellectual life, quite apart from the artistic life of Florence. And he went on to write what is probably the most influential and important book ever written on the Renaissance, and that's the his name now escapes me. The what is it called, Alexa? The
Oh my God,
history
no.
of the Renaissance in history of the Renaissance.
And now all I can think of is Manchester. There you go.
Italy, yes. It's in my defense. It's 1 minute after one here. So
I know. Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us, not only just for joining us to talk about your wonderful new book, but also because it is also quite a bit later there. And we just, from everyone at the AGO and everyone listening, I want to thank you so much, Ross King, for coming and sharing a bit with us about your newest book, which I enjoyed very much. And I hope that many people who do not yet have their copies will now be able to rush out and get them from their favorite local bookshop.
Absolutely. Honor Vespasiano by getting it from a nice bookshop.
Yes.
Of which Toronto and area has so many.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks, Alexa. Thank all of you.